Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, August 4th. There's nothing you can do about that. 2023. There's no stopping that either. But this time next year, it'll be August 4th, 2024. So how exciting is that? What a prospect to wait for. Will it be Saturday or will it be Thursday? I forget how the calendar works. How do calendars work? Everybody, can you check on that for me? Okay, well, at any rate, we have only this August 4th to deal with today. And good thing, too, because there's plenty to catch up on, and I don't know whether we're going to be able to get into everything, with our 2 hours. Oh, I'm being admonished to sign up with some kind of new Google service of some kind. I wonder what the hell it is. Get out of my face. That's my first instinct there. Second, my inclination is to run away from the responsibilities of the show and instead read this Esquire magazine piece that was basically put in my face by Pocket, I think, this morning as I was opening things up. And it has nothing to do with anything, and I don't know what to do about it, except it's intriguing nonetheless. I don't know. Who's written this thing? Who has lured me in with this piece? Dave Holmes. Congratulations on the headline writing and the pitching of this story. I don't know. It's the two weirdest years in music. Okay. Well, what would that be? 1989 and 1990. When I was a young man, just getting ready to graduate and then graduating from college. I was alive. I listened to music at that point. What was so weird about it? I don't think I recognized it right away at the time as extraordinarily weird, and I might not agree with this thesis. It just seems intriguing enough. Maybe you want to read it over the weekend. In 1989 and 90, the culture had not yet figured out what it wanted to be. What we got was the diet slice era. Refreshing, indistinct, and a harbinger of what was to come. I don't know. It's intriguing because I'd like to see what's the argument for calling this the diet slice era. One, of course, it harkens back. It's nostalgic. What even was slice or diet slice for that matter? And in case you weren't around or don't remember or never cared even when the thing was around, I mean, it was a soda, and it's explained here. The diet slice, it says, gets its name from the low-calorie version of Slice, a popular soft drink of the time which set itself apart from its shelf mates by claiming to be somewhat natural. Its can crowed with 10% real juice, later downgraded to contains real juice. And although I eventually stopped paying attention, and I think we are going to stop paying attention here, I bet toward the end it was more like, is technically a liquid. As a beverage, it was refreshing and indistinct, like the music of the time. You would consume it if it were there, but you are never thirsty for it. So, okay. That's a understandable explanation, and it's about how I guess I would have felt about the music at the time. But anyway, this is not a nostalgia program. We're not supposed to be here reading through this thing, but it is rather intriguing. It goes on to say that the defining characteristic of the diet slice is that the one time in pop music history when the ideal demographic seems to have been middle-aged. If the music of the MTV 80s and the Nirvana 90s were separate and high Richter youthquakes, the diet slice looked America's teenagers in the eyes, that is, and said, here is Michael Bolton, Cher, and Anita Baker. Have fun. The Billboard #1 single from 1989 was Look Away by a post-Peter Cetera Chicago. Go West dialed its synth funk down and its middle-of-the-road tendencies up and gave us its only real hit, King of Wishful Thinking. That doesn't even ring a bell for me. So anyway, just, an intriguing nostalgia article if you want to waste some time over the weekend. So I don't know. I'll put it to you. You might want to read this thing at some point. But then again, maybe not. Okay. So let's see. Other things to catch up on. Donald Trump, the former guy, is still indicted. Yesterday was his arraignment. Everybody had fun with that, and you can see why. And the indictment still stands, and we have yet to make our way all the way through it. And I really actually would like to do that because it is a fantastic narrative. And as I've been reading the various articles highlighting, or pointing out what it thinks are the highlights or the important parts of the indictment, I notice two things. One, that nobody selects the same things or, in their entirety of their group. And maybe that's what you're supposed to do. Well, I'll set my article apart by choosing some other thing or zeroing in on some other angle. But so it's no surprise that they don't all match, but it just varies from piece to piece. And then, also, the more I read of the indictment and the more I read of these summaries, the more I think there are things that they left out of every one of these summaries that just shouldn't be left out. I don't know. This is an extraordinarily important indictment in my view. And perhaps we can continue on reading through it. There are some other items that I wanted to share with you, though, and some other takes on the fact that this is the third indictment and is this the third arraignment and third arrest for Donald Trump since leaving office. That's pretty amazing all by itself. And there are other things happening around the fringes, both of other Trump cases, other near periphery of the Trump cases, and then, of course, major world events that we've been ignoring for a considerable amount of time because of this indictment looming. But having introduced the task again, I actually am going to return to reading the indictment because it's important homework that we all have to go through, and the juicy stuff is still coming. And then, of course, there's just the procedural interest in seeing how a case like this, or any case for that matter, but a case like this in particular, is laid out in this recitation of facts / narrative. This is a very, narrative-rich indictment, but also, it covers all the bases, of course, and does so in formal fashion. And then at the end, when you, the bulk of the indictment, the bulk of the pages is all about explaining that first count, that conspiracy to defraud the United States and conspiracy to deprive people of their rights. But then a quick recitation at the end that reminds you, all of these things are the elements of a fairly serious crime. And then, it's back to business at the end of the indictment. So we left off yesterday, according to my notes to myself, after paragraph 52. So we're about halfway through, but I think the second half reads maybe a little more quickly. But we had moved on to paragraph 53 is the beginning of the new section. The defendant's use of dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to organize fraudulent slates of electors and cause them to transmit false certificates to Congress. This is one of the more interesting and intriguing segments of the crime here. Because remember, I think as we were signing off yesterday, I was just saying, again, this was a big mystery to me, and we spent some time in the, late December, early January period when it became clear that the Republicans really were trying to engineer fake electoral slates and fake electoral certificates, and we wondered how in the world are they going to get this thing in front of Mike Pence. Just knowing the mechanics of the electoral vote count, you're only supposed to be reading the valid certificates, and the valid certificates are the ones that are mailed to the Senate in care of the President of the Senate, and to the National Archives and Records Administration, and to the local judges, etc. All of these things. And that, there's a staff that will open the envelopes and see what's inside them and then say, yes, these are the right certificates, and then put them in the pile and give it to somebody to carry to the floor. And the likelihood of fooling the actual staff into putting the fake certificates in there is about zero. You'd have to have their compliance. They'd have to agree that hey, it's an open question. I'll just have to, there's nothing I can do. I can make no decision. I should put both certificates in there and then leave it up to the vice president to decide what he wants to do with them. And that's what the Trump folks were, I guess, counting on. But there was no reason to believe that the staffers in the Senate were going to look at this stuff, and I assume maybe there were some House staffers involved as well because there's a joint session involved. But the idea that they would say, let's just put the other ones in there because they're not going to be the same. And remember, I guess this just comes from having seen the procedure a number of times and watched an electoral count vote happen several times and knowing the words of how it goes and how each time the vice president opens one of these things and hands it to the clerk or reads the certificate or hands it off to the tellers, that they go through the motions of saying, the certificate of electors, the ascertainment of electors for the state of Arizona appears to be regular in form and valid. And, they actually go through an exercise of saying the papers I'm looking at bear all the correct hallmarks, all the correct signs of being a true and accurate ascertainment and record of the electoral votes. And the fake electoral votes won't look like that. They might have been mocked up to look like that, but in some cases they're missing all sorts of elements that give them away right away. Like some of them we saw are missing the state seal, but they're missing in almost all, I guess in all instances, the governor's signature or the signature of the correct authority for each state that certifies that these are real. Those are just gone. So they won't be able to say the words truthfully, that this appears to be valid and regular in form and valid and et cetera, and appears to show that the votes went, and then you have to read out, everyone knows Biden won Arizona, but I'm saying the opposite. So it was very little chance that this was going to happen. But then, we found out the exciting truth was that all it came down to was, well, we just need someone to sneak it past. We know that the staffers are opening these envelopes and arranging these things to give to Mike Pence. We need to arrange somebody else to get a chance to meet with Mike Pence and slip him these papers. And then even if they do, right, it still counts on, people on the floor looking at them and saying, I don't know, they seem regular in form and authentic, but lying about it. And then, it has to be handed to tellers, and there's going to be tellers from the Democratic Party there, and they're going to look at them and say, this isn't real. And then they're going to just say, I'm not writing this down. There's just too many roadblocks to it to actually work. And then, of course, the exciting news was, well, who's going to be dumb enough to be the courier for these stupid fake electoral documents? And for people in Wisconsin, you got to throw your hat in the air and cheer because the answer was, who's dumb enough to do this? Senator Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, is dumb enough to do this. And he indeed attempted to do that. And that was shut down right away, as I was discussing with Greg, right? His staffer calls Pence's staffer and says, we've got something to give you. What is it? It's these electoral certificates. Answer, do not give them to us. Keep them away from us. They are weird and wrong and dangerous. We don't want anything to do with them. So here's the scheme. The defendant's use of dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to organize fraudulent slates of electors and cause them to transmit false certificates to Congress. This is before they even get to Ron Johnson's hand. They have to talk people into showing up on December 14th, trying to get into their state houses, in some cases being rebuffed by security, and then meeting and saying, let's sign something that looks like something that we've faked up to look like a real electoral certificate. And how do they get people to agree to that? And we already kind of know the backstory to that. But here we are in paragraph 53. As the defendant's attempts to obstruct the electoral vote through deceit of state officials met with repeated failure, because no one wanted anything to do with it, and everyone knew it was a stupid thing, beginning in early December 2020, he and co-conspirators developed a new plan to marshal individuals who would have served as the defendant's electors had he won the popular vote in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and cause those individuals to make and send to the Vice President and Congress false certifications that they were legitimate electors. Under the plan, the submission of these fraudulent slates would create a fake controversy at the certification proceeding and position the Vice President, presiding on January 6th as President of the Senate, to supplant legitimate electors with the defendant's fake electors and certify the defendant as president. Again, I know that this seems obvious on its face, but it's worth pausing and saying this is like I don't know, I'm sure there's a computer hacker analog, but you're attacking the democratic process at its root here, where, everyone knows, okay, everybody goes and votes for president. The person who has the most votes wins. Well, okay, not quite. We do the electoral college thing. So the person who has the most votes in each state, more or less, except for the ones that split it up funny, win the electoral votes from that state, and then you count those, and okay. We all understand the convoluted process of that. How do they translate that into, yes, everybody now agrees that this person is president? We just all assume, well, I saw it on the news. We all see the same news because there's only one fact about the winner of the election. You can't just go around saying alternative facts. Somebody else won the election, unless, of course, you can actually hack that at the root. How do they figure it out? Well, we told you about the process. The various the candidates choose who's going to be their electors if they should win ahead of time, and they tell each state, officials in each state, Joe Smith will be my elector. Let's say Ann Smith might also be an elector. Who knows? All right, we're trying to get everybody involved here. And you name your slate of electors if you win. So they have it all at the ready. And then when you do win, they look at the sheet you handed them and they say, these 14 people, depending, on what state you're in, are going to be the electoral college representatives from this state because this candidate won. The other 14 were given to us in case it went the other way, but we can throw that in the garbage because he didn't win. So these 14 are now expected to show up on December 14th here in the state capitol. We're going to give them some space and they'll formally cast their votes. State officials, governor, secretary of state, whatever it is, whoever's empowered to do this stuff in that state by statute, will sign their certificates. Everything is attested to. These are the 14 people that the candidates named. They all showed us their IDs. They're definitely them. We asked them, who are you going to vote for? They all said it out loud. Then they signed documents saying that they had voted for that person. And then I signed documents saying that these are the documents that they signed. And then we make 7 copies of them and we send them to all the official places. And that's how it's done. And then Congress opens it up and says, I attest that this is the thing that was properly prepared in the state and signed by the right people, and this is what it says. And then you count it up, and then in a joint session of Congress, you say this is the vote total, this is the electoral vote total, this is the winner, and that's how it's declared. So this is an attack at the level of what if trading places. What if we steal the frozen concentrated orange juice futures report and swap it with another one? We get in there and we say, everybody saw Biden win these states, but if we put papers in that say Trump won, they're going to be all confused and they're going to have to read it and, because it's in front of them and they'll be like, I didn't remember which state was, but as it happens, now we've edited it up and holy mackerel, Trump won. There was a math error. Or less far-fetched was, of course, the idea that they could say, well, I have 2 and I don't know which one is correct because I'm so confused. And they both look so official. And either you decide or I'm going to send them back to the states. They had 10 different ways to try to get Pence to do this thing. Whichever he would agree to, they would accept. But then he wouldn't agree to any of them because they were all stupid. But, just to reiterate, that's how basic it is. What if we just swapped the papers? What if we just said the opposite was true? Could we at least get people to say, wow, I'm so confused, I don't know what to do? That's what they were after. Section 54 here, paragraph 54, the plan capitalized on ideas presented in memoranda drafted by co-conspirator 5. And remember, we're thinking that co-conspirator 5 sounds a lot like Kenneth Chesebro, a attorney and I guess Trump partisan from Wisconsin. So this all rested on ideas presented in a memo that he wrote. He's an attorney who was assisting Trump's campaign with legal efforts related to a recount in Wisconsin. The memoranda evolved over time from a legal strategy to preserve the defendant's rights to a corrupt plan to subvert the federal government function by stopping Biden's electors' votes from being counted and certified, as follows. And I think they're explaining the evolution here, or maybe it's just what follows is just how they were going to accomplish purpose number 2. But when they say that this was started as an idea to preserve the defendant's rights and then into a corrupt plan, that refers to the goalpost moving of, well, we just want you to meet and cast electoral votes in case we are successful in Wisconsin and other states in getting the courts to throw out the results of the election, or at least the validity of the Biden elector's certificate. And rather than leave Wisconsin without electoral votes on January 6th, we can then at least say, all right, well, the Democratic slate isn't right. Here's an alternative slate. Happens to be from Republicans, but it's the only other Wisconsin slate there is. So use this, which is how they got most people to sign on to the effort. So you're only going to use this if a court says the other slate is being thrown out, right? Right, they said. And then, of course, they couldn't get any courts to throw out the other slates. So then they said, well, it's either pack it up and go home, or let's make one last-ditch effort. Let's just slip them these other ones that people were assured would only be used in case we won in court, and slip those to Mike Pence even though we lost in court, and see what happens. Well, that's where it becomes a corrupt plan. I mean, it was a corrupt plan really from the beginning, but if nobody ends up submitting the certificates or even attempting to get them used, then arguably, well, maybe they avoid the crime here. So here we are, paragraph 54A. This is how the plot goes down. The November 18th memorandum, the Wisconsin memo, they call it hereinafter, advocated that because of the ongoing recount in Wisconsin, the defendants' electors there should meet and cast votes on December 14th. That's the date that the Electoral Count Act required appointed electors to vote. And they should do so to preserve the alternative of the defendant's Wisconsin elector slate in the event the defendant ultimately prevailed in the state. The December 6th memorandum, later on, about a month later, for the fraudulent elector memo, as they call it, marked a sharp departure from co-conspirator 5's Wisconsin memo, advocating that the alternate electors originally conceived of to preserve rights in Wisconsin instead be used in a number of states as fraudulent electors to prevent Biden from receiving the 270 electoral votes necessary to secure the presidency on January 6th. The fraudulent elector memo suggested that the defendants' electors in 6 purportedly, quote-unquote, contested states, here, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Who's missing? New Mexico, right? That was the weird one in the first list. Those electors, or those fake electors, should meet and mimic as best as possible the actions of the legitimate electors, those would be the Biden electors, and that on January 6th, the vice president should open and count the fraudulent votes, setting up at least a fake controversy that would derail the proper certification of Biden as president-elect. And paragraph C, the December 9th memorandum, 3 days later, that one's called the Fraudulent Elector Instructions, consisted of co-conspirator 5, Chesebro's, instructions on how fraudulent electors could mimic legitimate electors in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Chesebro, co-conspirator 5, noted that in some states, it would be virtually impossible for the fraudulent electors to successfully take the same steps as the legitimate electors because state law required formal participation in the process by state officials. or access to official resources. And I would think that that would happen in virtually every single state, not just some states. But again, just to put a fine enough point on it, this is the rough equivalent of saying, well, I'm all out of dollars to pay my bills. But if you look at cash, all it really is a Federal Reserve note, and it's printed in a certain fashion, but then signed by the Secretary of the Treasury and the Treasurer of the United States. Supposing we put together something that looked more or less exactly like that, and we had an alternative Treasurer of the United States and an alternative Secretary of the Treasury, and they signed it on behalf of the Federal Reserve, or purportedly on behalf of the Federal Reserve, and we used that to purchase goods and services in the economy. That's, of course, called counterfeiting. The document is a forgery, and you're immediately, well, eventually they get around to arresting you. The Secret Service would be very interested in that because they actually have jurisdiction over that sort of thing. But everyone knows, yeah, you can't do that. It's actually a huge crime. They were just doing the same thing here, not with currency, but with electoral certificates. Let's just make something that's supposed to look exactly like it, and maybe it'll get used, maybe it won't get used, but at a minimum, we're hoping people will throw up their hands and say, I can't tell which one is real, or don't want to tell which one is real anyway. And depending on how crazy you are, you either declare the fake one to be real, or you say, well, gee whiz, let's all have a vote about what we ought to do with this thing, and maybe a Republican majority emerges for accepting the fake ones, or at least sending them back to the states. And that was the big hope. If you can't get anybody to actually decide that the fake ones are real, because that's embarrassing, send them back to the states, make it a state problem, and just delay things. That's all they were looking for at that point.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So, as we exited just before the break, as we said, at a minimum, all they were hoping for, at the very least, was a way to confuse enough people, or for them to pretend to be confused, and then send things back to the states and thereby delay the certification of Biden's win and push it past January 6th. I think they outline later on, under the mistaken notion, or the novel notion anyway, that if the Electoral Count Act required that the new president's election be ascertained on the 6th of January, and it wasn't ascertained on the 6th of January, but, even if it were later ascertained on the 7th or 8th or 9th of January, that one of these childish understandings of law, which is to say not understanding law. Well, the law says it has to be done on January 6th, but this was done on January 7th, so it's invalid. He's not the president. And in the absence of there being a president, well, the current president continues being president until there's a new president, none of which is actually the way anything works. It's just not. But they were hoping that they could say so, and, either, all of Congress would agree, or the majority of Americans would agree, or enough Americans to be able to threaten riots in the streets from the Republican side would agree. And And it would have worked, I mean, in that sense, because there are still people out there that actually believe that. There are Democrats or, people who vote Democratic, who are, lay people who I see on social media right now insisting that would have worked. Yeah, if you don't get it right with Biden and get the electoral votes counted correctly, come January 20th, he's not sworn in and Trump continues because he's already president, except the Constitution is actually quite clear that the president's term, the Constitution says it, it's no joke, says that the president's term ends on January 20th and the new president is sworn in, and that's that. If they don't swear in a new president, that's one thing, but it doesn't say, well, if nobody shows up, you just keep being president. It tells you when the president's term ends. If the president's term ends and they can't swear in a new president, what do? Well, they don't have a president and they don't have a vice president because the terms have ended and they haven't sworn in the new ones. The answer is Speaker of the House is the next highest ranking person in the line of succession to the presidency, and the then current Speaker of the House. And they have one because they met on January 3rd and did their voting, swore in the new members, voted and installed a new Speaker of the House. Of course, if it was this time around and it was Kevin McCarthy and it took 15 ballots and several days, I mean, I guess if you stretch the process out long enough and January 20th rolls around and you haven't elected a Speaker of the House, well, that's a problem. But how do you solve that problem? Senate President Pro Tem is the President of the United States. There's a whole statute. It's all spelled out. You should have no fear that legally speaking, Donald Trump would just continue in office. My point is there are still people out there who are, Democrats, progressives, what have you, who I see saying on social media that, yeah, he just continues as president. No, he doesn't. All right, moving on. Paragraph now 56. On December 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator 2, that's Eastman, called the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee. Did I skip any? Yeah, I think I did. I skipped number 55 here. Sorry, I'll turn around and go back here. The plan began in early December, and ultimately, the conspirators and the defendants' campaign took the Wisconsin memo. Remember those two memos. That's the Wisconsin memo is the November 18th memo that says maybe we could preserve Trump's rights while we await the outcome in court by having people vote as though they were electors. And then there's the fraudulent elector memo of December 6th. That's the departure from that plan, saying actually we should just try to confuse everybody by sending in fake certificates. And then the December 11th memorandum, the fraudulent elector instructions, was Cheeseborough telling people how to fake up a document in order to execute the fraudulent elector memo plan of December 6th. So the plan began in early December, right? That's with the fraudulent elector memo, I guess. And ultimately, the conspirators and the defendants' campaign took the Wisconsin memo, the 18th memo. That's the November memo from before the plan began, according to paragraph 55, and expanded it to any state that the defendant claimed was, quote, contested. Even New Mexico, that one weird state that was in the list and then out of the list, now it's back in. Why? The defendant claims to have won New Mexico, even though the defendant had lost by more than 10% of the popular vote. This expansion was forecast by emails that the defendant's chief of staff sent on December 6th, forwarding the Wisconsin memo to campaign staff and writing, "We just need to have someone coordinating the electors for states. We're going to take this memo about preservation of rights and just use it where we have no rights whatsoever." Okay. Paragraph 56. On December 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator 2, Eastman, called the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, Ronna Romney McDaniel, right? And to ensure that the plan was in motion. Wow, she should not have been involved in that. During the call, co-conspirator 2, Eastman, told the chairwoman that it was important for the RNC to help the defendant's campaign gather electors in targeted states and falsely represented to her that such electors' votes would only be used if ongoing litigation in one of the states resulted in a change in the defendant's favor. After the RNC chairwoman consulted the campaign and heard that work on gathering electors was underway, she called and reported this information to the defendant, Trump, who responded approvingly. Paragraph 57. On December 7th, co-conspirator 1, Rudy, received the Wisconsin memo and the fraudulent elector memo. Co-conspirator 1 spoke with co-conspirator 6, and here we're moving on from thinking that it was Mike Roman to another guy that I hadn't heard of, but I can't remember who it was pointed out. Oh, yeah, right, Boris Epstein. So that's right. Greg was telling us it's Boris Epstein. So Rudy speaks to Boris regarding attorneys who could assist in the fraudulent elector effort in the targeted states, and he received from co-conspirator 6 an email identifying attorneys in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. No one knows why New Mexico is on the list. The next day, on December 8th, co-conspirator 5, Cheeseborough, called the Arizona attorney on Boris Epstein's list, co-conspirator 6 lists. In an email after the call, the Arizona attorney recounted his conversation with Cheeseborough as follows. I just talked to the gentleman who did that memo, co-conspirator 5. His idea is basically that all of us, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, etc., have our electors send in their votes, even though the votes aren't legal under federal law, because they're not signed by the governor. So that members of Congress can fight about whether they should be counted on January 6th. They could potentially argue that they're not bound by federal law because they're Congress and they make the law, etc., etc. Kind of wild/creative. I'm happy to discuss. My comment to him was that I guess there's no harm in it, legally at least. Well, I guess there is because they're all indicted now. I.e., we would just be sending in fake electoral votes to Pence so that someone in Congress can make an objection when they start counting votes and start arguing that the fake votes should be counted. It's an interesting conclusion to reach. I guess we could forge this document. I guess we could counterfeit these Federal Reserve notes. There's no harm in it because, at the cash register, people could just argue about whether or not they're going to accept them. And really, honestly, if you're going to give full faith and credit to this note, then what's the difference? Commerce continues as always, and you can probably convince others to give full faith and credit to this forged note too. Right? No harm, no foul. No, they're very wrong about that. You've actually committed a huge crime here. Okay, so it's bad legal advice at a minimum. Next up, at co-conspirator 1's direction, that's Rudy, on December 10th, co-conspirator 5, Cheeseborough, sent to points of contact in all targeted states except Wisconsin, which had already received his memos, of course, and New Mexico. For some reason, he didn't send his memos to New Mexico, or this revised version. He sends them a streamlined version of the Wisconsin memo, which did not reveal the intended fraudulent use of defendants' electors, and the fraudulent elector instructions, along with fraudulent elector certificates that he had drafted. So he sends them a kit, how to forge an electoral college voting certificate, and doesn't tell them the part about, well, we're going to use it whether we win in court or not. That he keeps from them. The next day, on December 11th, through co-conspirator 5, co-conspirator 1 suggested that the Arizona lawyer file a petition for certiorari in the Supreme Court as a pretext to claim that litigation was pending in the state. Remember, there are still people who believe that they would only use this thing pending the outcome of litigation. But then they noticed, hey, there's no litigation in my state. So part of the plan was, hey, get a lawyer to file a claim so that we can say, there you go, there's pending litigation right there. That's the one we were talking about that enables us to use your certificate if we win. But then later on, they disregard that whole thing. So there you go. December 11th, they get a lawyer in Arizona to file a petition for certiorari in the Supreme Court as a pretext to claim that litigation was pending in the state to provide cover for the convening and voting of the defendant's fraudulent electors there. Co-conspirator 5 explained that co-conspirator 1 had heard from a state official and state provisional elector that, quote, it could appear treasonous for the Arizona electors to vote on Monday, the 14th, if there is no pending court proceeding. That was the worry. They said, you want me to show up on the 14th and cast my vote? I have a problem. Unless, as you say, this whole thing is used only if you prevail in litigation, unless there's actually litigation going on, we're going to be exposed as liars. And not only are we going to be exposed as liars, he says, quote, it could appear treasonous for us to just ignore the outcome of the election, show up and pretend we're the Electoral College, right? So what's the answer? The answer is don't do it. But the answer that's offered to him is, we'll fake up some litigation too. We're going to fake being electors. We might as well fake some litigation as well. It's no problem. It's probably not even illegal to just file a claim. And, that's a total loser. There's nothing illegal about that. So sure, we'll take care of that problem. And now you have your litigation. Now you're not a traitor. How do you feel? And he showed up for work, I think, that guy. Paragraph 61, to manage the plan in Pennsylvania. On December 12th, co-conspirator 1, co-conspirator 5, and co-conspirator 6, Rudy Cheeseborough Epstein, as we're now thinking, participated in a conference call organized by the defendant, Trump's campaign, with the defendant's electors in that state, Pennsylvania. When the defendant's electors expressed concern about signing certificates representing themselves as legitimate electors, like they were actually smart, co-conspirator 1 falsely assured them that their certificates would only be used if the defendant succeeded in litigation. Same excuse, right? Subsequently, co-conspirator 6 circulated proposed conditional language to that effect for potential inclusion in the fraudulent elector certificates. A campaign official cautioned, this is interesting, so they're being smart, we'll only sign this fake electoral certificate if there's additional language that says this is only to be used if Trump prevails in court and for some reason the real Pennsylvania electors are thrown out. We just want Pennsylvania represented. Here's a backup. It's we're the electors for Trump, and we say Trump won. And if the court agrees, then count our certificate. Now, they win that and they get the concession. But then a campaign official cautioned not to offer the conditional language to other states because the other states, this is a quote, the other states are signing what he prepared, and if it gets out that we change the language for Pennsylvania, it could snowball. And in other words, they're saying, if you say how smart the Pennsylvania fake electors were to protect themselves, all the other states are going to want that protection too. And then if people examine the certificates and they see this language that says it's only supposed to be used in a certain case, then it might not be successfully used to cause confusion. People in the Congress, instead of becoming confused, they might say, we know that this is not a valid certificate because they didn't win that litigation. So it would be that much more difficult, or at least less logical, to be used as the basis for the fight to delay things on January 6th. So in some cases, the defendants' electors refused to participate in the plan, at least in Pennsylvania, even with the cautionary language. Paragraph 62. On December 13th, co-conspirator 5 sent co-conspirator 1 an email memorandum that further confirmed that the conspirators' plan was not to use the fraudulent electors only in the circumstances that the defendant's litigation was successful in one of the targeted states. Instead, the plan was to falsely present the fraudulent slates as an alternative to the legitimate slates at Congress's certification proceeding. Just like we were talking about yesterday, they move the goalposts. Well, we'll use litigation, and if we win the litigation, then we'll have these alternative slates. Well, you lost the litigation. What now? Well, let's just use the alternative slates anyway and see if we can cause confusion. And then when they weren't able to do that, well, let's just lay siege to the Capitol and threaten the lives of the people who are voting in the joint session and tell them we'll murder them if they don't vote to accept Trump's electoral certificates anyway. Well, that's a bit of an escalation, and that's why they're in trouble now. Anyway, paragraph 63, we're not quite there yet. On December 13th, the defendant asked the senior campaign advisor for an update on what was going on with the elector plan and directed him to put out a statement on electors. As a result, co-conspirator 1, Rudy, directed the senior campaign advisor to join a conference call with him, co-conspirator 6, Epstein, and others. When the senior campaign advisor related these developments in text messages to the deputy campaign manager, a senior advisor to the defendant, and a campaign staffer, the deputy campaign manager responded, quote, "Here's the thing. The way this has morphed, it's a crazy play. So I don't know who wants to put their name on it." That's pretty plain. The senior advisor wrote, "certifying illegal votes." That's what he's made of this whole plan. What we're doing is certifying illegal votes. And remember, every Republican confession or every Republican accusation is a confession, right? What's the big beef here? Biden's election has to be invalidated because they were counting and certifying illegal votes in these states. So what's the proper answer in the Republican mind? We'll certify some illegal votes of our own, but they'll be more powerful votes than the votes that we say Democrats were certifying. We say Democrats were merely certifying illegal immigrants or dead people or whatever to vote. But we're going to certify illegal electoral college votes to try to circumvent that and override it. But of course, every accusation is a confession. In turn, the participants in the group text message refused to have a statement regarding electors attributed to their names because none of them could, quote, stand by it. So what has happened in this paragraph? Trump asks, what's going on with the electors? And then says, I want you to put out a statement on the electors. Of course, the statement he wants is that there are 6, maybe 7 states where the electors are really his and not Biden's, and he should really be the true winner. The top brass get together and say, what are we going to do about this demand by the boss that there be a statement? And their conclusion is, well, we could write a statement, but I'm not putting my name on it. Me neither. No one on the conference call would put their name on it because they all knew it was wrong. Paragraph 64, also on December 13th, same day, at a campaign staffer's request, co-conspirator 5 drafted and sent fraudulent elector certificates for the defendant's electors in New Mexico, which had not previously been among the targeted states, and where there was no pending litigation on the defendant's behalf. The next day, the defendant's campaign filed an election challenge suit in New Mexico at 11:54 a.m., 6 minutes before the noon deadline for the electors' votes. Right? Do you see what's happening? The Electoral College is going to meet everywhere across the country on December 14th to cast their votes. New Mexico has X number, whatever their electoral vote count is, of Republicans willing to pretend that they're the real electors and vote for Trump, but only if there's ongoing litigation, right? So at 11:54 a.m., December 14th, 6 minutes before the actual vote is supposed to be taken for the Electoral College, they run to the courthouse and file a claim, and then, I guess, get on a cell phone and call the electors and say, with 5 minutes before you're supposed to vote, there is now pending litigation. Isn't that amazing? Wow. That's really cutting it close, to say the least. So, on December 14th, the legitimate electors of all 50 states and the District of Columbia met in their respective jurisdictions to formally cast their votes for president, resulting in a total of 232 electoral votes for the defendant and 306 for Biden. The legitimate electoral votes that Biden won in the states that the defendant targeted and the defendant's margin of defeat were as follows. Arizona, which has 11 electoral votes, the margin of victory for Biden was 10,457 votes. In Georgia, with its 16 electoral votes, the margin was 11,779 votes. Remember, I think he actually gives it that number when he calls Raffensperger and says, you got to find us that number of votes. He wants 11,780, right? Michigan, 16 electoral votes, 154,188 votes. That's not really all that close. In Nevada, with its 6 electoral votes, the margin was 33,596 votes. In New Mexico, 5 electoral votes, the margin was 99,720 votes. And remember, although that's a raw number below Michigan's raw number, New Mexico's population much smaller. That was a 10% margin of victory in New Mexico. Pennsylvania and its 20 electoral votes was decided by 80,555 votes, and in Wisconsin, 10 electoral votes, the margin was 20,682 votes. Paragraph 66. On the same day, at the direction of the defendant and co-conspirator 1, fraudulent electors convened sham proceedings in the 7 targeted states to cast fraudulent electoral ballots in favor of the defendant. In some states, in order to satisfy legal requirements set forth for legitimate electors under state law, state officials were enlisted to provide the fraudulent electors access to state capitol buildings so that they could gather and vote there. In many cases, however, as co-conspirator 5 had predicted in the fraudulent elector instructions memo, the fraudulent electors were unable to satisfy the legal requirements. Remember, these are the people who believed that if they can delay the electoral count until January 7th, well, that's a technical enough violation to say the whole thing doesn't count and Biden's not the president. And remember, the instructions in the Electoral Count Act and in the Constitution are that the electors will meet in the state capitals to cast their vote. Not the city, the Capitol building is how that's interpreted. And so they said, we got to be able to meet in the Capitol. Now, what that normally means, I've attended the Electoral College vote in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it does indeed take place in the state capitol building in Richmond. But more to the point for this issue is, well, the legitimate electors are given access to the floor of the House. I think it was the House and not the Senate. But they use one of the chambers for the official meeting. I mean, I guess you could do it anywhere. You could do it in the bathroom if you wanted to. If you arrange for it ahead of time, or everyone agrees that that's where you're going to meet, I guess you can meet anywhere. But probably the reason they choose to use the floor of one of the chambers is to give it an air of official, the imprimatur of being an official proceeding. Important things in this building, the stuff that counts, the stuff that's binding, is stuff that's done on the floor of one of the 2 chambers. Usually both eventually, and not in the bathroom or at the snack bar. So that's why. And there's usually no issue in giving it to them because the legislature's not in session, and the only people in the building on December 14th are them. And so they give them the use of the chamber, or even if the legislature is in session, they just don't gavel into session at that point, let them use the chamber. So the problem for the fake electors is that the official place is busy, and nobody who has the right to allow somebody else access to the building has the right to also say, we're going to kick the legit electors out and put the fake electors on the floor. Make the legit electors vote in the bathroom or whatever. So there's another whole physical barrier to this thing. Just like how are you going to get those fake certificates in front of the vice president and past all the staffers and everything? You got to short circuit the process and see if Ron Johnson will be dumb enough to do it for you. Here you had to recruit somebody in the state capitals, and some of them we see videotape of their surveillance tape of them opening a side door to the building and hustling people in and giving them a committee room. That's an official looking place, giving them a committee room to vote in instead. Why are they there? Because, well, the real place is already occupied, which is pretty good evidence that you're not legit voters anyway. And then sneaking in the side entrance probably doesn't look all that good either. But there you go. That's actually what they tried to do. Now, nonetheless, as directed in the fraudulent elector instructions, shortly after the fraudulent electors met on December 14th, the targeted states' fraudulent elector certificates were mailed to the President of the Senate, the Archivist of the United States, they're trying to mimic the process, and others. The defendant and co-conspirators ultimately used the certificates of these fraudulent electors to deceitfully target the government function, the one that we're so worried about being disrupted, and that is the basis of the crime. And they did so contrary to how fraudulent electors were told they would be used. So there's a fraud on the electors themselves as well. Paragraph 68. Unlike those of the fraudulent electors, consistent with the Electoral Count Act, the legitimate electors' signed certificates were annexed to the state executive's certificates of ascertainment before being sent to the President of the Senate and others. And that was the real issue that we were talking about. How do you get the papers to the Vice President or onto the floor of the House during the joint session if the staffers who prepare the papers for them know the difference between what looks real and what looks fake? How can you tell? Everybody uses kind of a different form. Each state has their own thing, but it's sort of official looking. And the answer is that the fake certificates show up and it's just a certificate and says, I'm an elector and I voted for X. The real ones show up that say, I'm an elector and I voted for Y, and here is a certificate signed by the governor or secretary of state or whoever from my state guaranteeing that, yes, I am who I said I am. He checked my ID. He saw me cast this vote. It was all done regularly and in accordance with law, and he says so according to this paper. A very major difference between the two kinds of certificates that are going to show up. And remember, the plan is to say, I don't know which one, to get Republicans in Congress to say, throw up their hands. I can't tell which one's which. They both look so official. Sure, this one has an additional certificate saying it's real and it's signed by the governor, and the other one has nothing, and it's weird and it looks like a Microsoft template of some kind. But we'll just have to leave it to the state legislature to decide. Now, what's the state legislature going to say? Are they going to recognize the governor's signature from their state? Are they going to recognize that it's missing from the other one? Yes. But the plan again here is either one, who cares? We just want delay because that's enough to disrupt the election. Or two, we'll send it back to states with Republican supermajorities and they'll just vote to ignore reality and ignore the facts and say the fake one that didn't have the certificate saying that it was real is actually real, and send it back and say, now what are you going to do? That's all they wanted to do. Gee whiz, that's all. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. It's officially lawn mowing time again. Listen. Can you hear that drone in the background? All right, well, hopefully it stays difficult to hear. But at any rate, we left off having just read you the paragraph saying that the big difference between the fake elector certificates and the real elector certificates is the real elector certificates had an additional certificate with them saying, by the way, these are real. I mean, they could have faked those up too, but they decided not to do that. That would have, I assume, have been an even bigger crime if Cheeseborough had said, yeah, what you do is you take one of these certificates of ascertainment and then you should Photoshop the governor's signature onto it and staple that to it. I don't know whether they ever gave any consideration to that or didn't know that there was such a thing, or were just like, that's actually too big of a crime here. If we make it obvious that it's fake, and can talk lunatics in Congress and in the state legislatures into believing them anyway, I think they might not be chargeable with the crime of obviously voting for a fake over the real thing, because they might have sort of like speech and debate clause style immunity from it, from prosecution for it rather. And if we don't attach the fraudulent document saying that the governor says these are all right, we might be able to escape liability there too. And so far they have, because they're unindicted co-conspirators, but I don't think that's going to last forever. I think they're, the tactic of moving the Trump case first, is the end of that, period of grace. And then eventually they get charged as well. Unless, of course, the case against Trump somehow falls apart. Anyway, that leaves us on paragraph 69. Nice. That evening at 6:26 p.m., I guess we're still talking about the 14th of December, the RNC chairwoman forwarded to the defendant, through his executive assistant, an email titled Electors Recap Final, which represented that in 6 contested states, and it's the same list, again, but this time leaving out New Mexico, In 6 contested states, the defendants' electors had voted in parallel to Biden's electors. The defendant's executive assistant responded, "It's in front of him!" exclamation point. So, as you know, whatever's in front of Trump is what he believes at the moment. So I guess that was the importance of that transmission. Now a new section. We're done with how the conspirators used and the defendant used deceit to engineer the production of these documents. Now the defendants attempt to leverage the Justice Department to use deceit to get state officials to replace legitimate electors and electoral votes with the defendants. Here they're trying to get the state legislatures to step in and say, we certify to you, in the absence of the governor's signature on a certificate of ascertainment, will you accept the gerrymandered Republican supermajority legislature's declaration that despite it all, those are the real ones? That's what they're trying to do. Now, specifically, they want the states to do this. You might ask, why would a state agree to do this? 1, partisanship. They just want Trump to win. And 2, if that's not enough to motivate them to do it, Trump tries to get the Justice Department to do things that would be adjudged sufficient in the state legislatures, these partisan state legislatures, to justify that action. That is, he tries to get the Department of Justice to say in some official capacity to the state legislators, there's enough doubt and we're investigating it and you would be on solid ground to pull this stupid stunt. And you could, if you were worried about the legitimacy of it, you could point and say the Justice Department told us this was what we should be doing because this problem was so serious. This allegation of fraud is being taken so seriously and has such a likelihood of changing the outcome of the election if you really look into it. If you take a look at it, if you take a close look at it, you'll decide, right? So this is what they're trying to do. All right, paragraph 70. In late December 2020, the defendant attempted to use the Justice Department to make knowingly false claims of election fraud to officials in the targeted states through a formal letter under the acting Attorney General's signature, thus giving the defendant's lies the backing of the federal government and attempting to improperly influence the targeted states to replace legitimate Biden electors with the defendants. And remember, the plan is to have the acting Attorney General sign this thing. Why? Because the actual Attorney General, Bill Barr, has resigned by that point. He's out of there and he wants nothing to do with anything. So now they have an acting Attorney General, but the acting Attorney General won't do it. The acting Deputy Attorney General won't do it. And this is where the plot comes in to make Jeffrey Clark, who's now co-conspirator 4 in all of this, we'll make him the acting Attorney General, and then he'll sign it, and that's how we'll get it done, right? The rest of the Justice Department was like, no thanks, we're not doing this. Paragraph 71, this is where this all comes together. On December 22nd, the defendant met with co-conspirator 4, Jeff Clark, at the White House. Co-conspirator 4 had not informed his leadership at the Justice Department of the meeting, which was a violation of the Justice Department's written policy restricting contacts with the White House to guard against improper political influence. What's happening here? In official terms, the president on December 22nd, in the middle of this crisis, has called to his office for a meeting the head of the environmental law section of the Department of Justice, with the idea in mind of firing everybody in the Justice Department who outranks him and making him the top person there and turning him into the acting Attorney General. Guy's had no experience whatsoever at that level. And while he's got a fairly senior position, he's also got a position that comes with the following restriction that has just been recited. This guy is not allowed to meet with the president without the permission of his superiors at the Justice Department, because there's no effing reason in the world why the head of the environmental law section at the Justice Department should be being called into an a contested election meeting with the President of the United States. There's no call for it. He has nothing to do with it. And If for some reason there was a legitimate reason, then, of course, his superiors at the Justice Department would say, sure, yes, he's currently the head of environmental litigation, but he came up in the department in electoral law, and the person who's actually occupying that spot at the moment has less experience or is dead, whatever. Then we might give permission for somebody like Jeff Clark to show up and have a meeting with the president. But absent anything like that, no, we would not give our permission, which is why he went without their permission. And it happens over and over. Paragraph 72 here. On December 26th, co-conspirator 4, Clark, spoke on the phone with the acting attorney general and lied about the circumstances of his meeting with the defendant at the White House, falsely claiming that the meeting had been unplanned. We heard you just had a meeting with the president. That violates our policy. You didn't ask our permission first. Why did he want to talk to you? About environmental law? No, we know that the discussion was about electoral law. What were you doing there? Well, it wasn't planned. I was just walking down the street and the president said I should come into his office. And what am I going to do? He's the president of the United States. I have to follow his orders. I went in. That's the story that he gives him. The acting attorney general directed co-conspirator 4. Well, okay, listen. From now on, you are not to have unauthorized contacts with the White House. And co-conspirator 4 said he would not. So issue settled, right? Well, the next morning, December 27th, contrary to the acting attorney general's direction, co-conspirator 4 spoke with the defendant, the president of the United States at the time, on the defendant's cell phone for nearly 3 minutes. I mean, the fact that they really wind up for nearly, I thought they were going to say nearly an hour, 3 minutes. But 3 minutes with the president is pretty consequential for somebody at his rank, so there you go. But the explicit instruction was no more contact with the White House. And the very next day he said, you know what? I'm going to actually do some contact with the White House. That afternoon, the defendant called the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general and said, among other things, quote, people tell me, the co-conspirator 4, Jeff Clark, people tell me Jeff Clark is great. I should put him in. The defendant also raised multiple false claims of election fraud, which the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general refuted. And I haven't used my recording yet, when the acting attorney general told the defendant that the Justice Department could not and would not change the outcome of the election, the defendant responded, and this is now infamous, right? Just say that the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman, right? You guys are such Boy Scouts. You won't say that the election was stolen and that Trump is the real winner. Well, I'll take it off your hands. You just say that you suspect that it was corrupt, and we'll be the ones to describe how it was corrupt and convince people that it was corrupt. You just say that the Justice Department thinks it might be, and that should be enough. Will you just do that for me? But they wouldn't do it, because it was wrong. So he thought, I'll get Jeff Clark to do it instead. Paragraph 75, on December 28th, co-conspirator 4 sent a draft letter to the acting attorney general and the acting deputy attorney general. Remember, both the real attorney general is gone, and I don't know whether there had been a deputy attorney general for real for a long time, but both of those positions are vacant in the middle of this crisis. Both of these guys are acting just like the whole rest of the Trump government, really. Acting. That's why we have this clip of acting, because it was so stupid how often we actually had to use it. So on December 28th, co-conspirator sends a draft letter to the two remaining acting top people at the Justice Department, in which he proposed they all sign. They must have said, well, it would be important if we signed it. It's actually not important that you sign it. You're nobody. But he proposes we all sign it so that he can be famous too. The draft was addressed to state officials in Georgia, and co-conspirator 4, Clark, proposed sending versions of the letter to elected officials in other targeted states. Probably the other 5 of the 6. I don't know whether they had designs on New Mexico at that point. The proposed letter contained numerous knowingly false claims about the election and the Justice Department. Many of them will be familiar to you. They include that, A, the Justice Department had, quote, identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states. B, the Justice Department believed that in Georgia and in other states, two valid slates of electors had gathered at the proper location on December 14th, and both sets of ballots had been transmitted to Congress. That is, co-conspirator 4's letter sought to advance the defendant's fraudulent elector plan by using the authority of the Justice Department to falsely present the fraudulent electors as a valid alternative to the legitimate electors. Why the Justice Department would say it's a valid alternative when it lacks the certification of the governor's signature, no one has any idea. It's just they thought that maybe a letter from the Justice Department would substitute for the lack of signature by the governor. People would say, well, I'm troubled by this. This set of electors is signed as valid by the governor, and this set of electors is not. Yes, well, here's a letter from the Justice Department that says the one that doesn't have it is just as good. And you know what they are at the Justice Department? They're lawyers. You should listen to the lawyers. Now you're confused again, right? Yes, this has raised me to the level of confusion. I can no longer tell the difference between this one and this one. This one the governor says is real. This one the Justice Department says is real. Two real things. Which one do I want to pick? Well, I'm a Republican. I want to pick this one. That was the plan. That's the whole plan at this point, except for the part about how when that fails, we can just kill everybody. That hadn't been discussed yet. Then C, the letter would also allege that the Justice Department urged that the state legislature convene a special legislative session to create the opportunity to, among other things, choose the fraudulent electors over the legitimate electors. That's the plan at this point. The acting Deputy Attorney General promptly responded to co-conspirator 4 by email and told him that this proposed letter was false, writing, quote, despite dramatic claims to the contrary, we have not seen the type of fraud that calls into question the reported and certified results of the election. In a meeting shortly thereafter, the acting Attorney General and the acting Deputy Attorney General again directed co-conspirator 4 not to have unauthorized contact with the White House. We have warned you once, and then you went back and did it again, and now we're warning you a second time. Don't have unauthorized contact with the White House. You're a nobody. Plus, you're plotting some dumb illegal stuff. Don't do it. Paragraph 77. On December 31st, the defendant summoned to the Oval Office the acting Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, and other advisors. In the meeting, the defendant again raised claims about election fraud that Justice Department officials had already told him were not true, and that the senior Justice Department officials reiterated were false, and suggested he might change the leadership in the Justice Department. I want to install people who will tell me that these things are true. Paragraph 78. On January 2nd, 2021, we're getting close here, just 4 days before Congress's certification proceeding, co-conspirator 4 tried to coerce the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General to sign and send co-conspirator 4's draft letter, which contained those false statements, to the state officials. He told them that defendant was considering making him, co-conspirator 4, the new acting Attorney General. But that co-conspirator 4 would decline the defendant's offer if the acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General would agree to send the proposed letter to the targeted states. The Justice Department officials refused. That's a famous story. Now we all know that, but just to, make sure everybody understands what's going on here, Clark says, nice jobs you've got there, acting Attorney General and acting Deputy Attorney General. Would be a shame if something happened to them, and we could prevent something from happening to them if you sign this letter. If you don't, then I'll be the acting Attorney General, and you'll just be out on your ass. And no one will be any of the wiser either, because everybody in this administration is an acting official of some kind or another, and I'll just be one among many. will be on our 17th attorney general in one term. And that's not weird or anything. And anyway, then the point is that letter will get sent. It's getting sent one way or another, he says. You know, he thinks he's like laying down the law. This thing is getting sent one way or the other. It can get sent with you or without you. And in point of fact, one, he never became anything, much less attorney general. Two, the letter never got sent. And three, he's now an unindicted, for the moment, co-conspirator in all of this. And I don't think that he remains unindicted for long. So I like that he lays down the law, and then they're like, actually, that's not the law, and it's not actually going to happen. Now, paragraph 79, the next morning, January 3rd, despite having uncovered no additional evidence of election fraud, co-conspirator 4 sent to a Justice Department colleague an edited version of his draft letter to the states, which included a change from its previous claim that the Justice Department had concerns to an act. You'd think at this point he's like, okay, well, I can't get this past them. I'm going to redraft this thing and we'll take it down a notch and see if we can get other Justice Department officials on board, maybe the milder version we can send out. No, not what Clark did. He actually steps it up and says that instead of the previous claim that the Justice Department had, quote, concerns, to a stronger false claim that, quote, as of today, there is evidence of significant irregularities that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states. Not that we're concerned that there may be fraud, but that that there was fraud and that we have evidence of it. Wow. Well, that's a jump. I guess you could say he doesn't say that there was fraud. He just says we have evidence of it. We have evidence. It's fake evidence. Maybe, I don't know whether he thinks he's covering his ass this way or not, but that's interesting that instead of toning it down to see if he can get it passed, he steps it up. He's just that confident that he's going to end up as Attorney General. And nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, so there we go. Paragraph 80 says, also on the morning of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 met with the defendant at the White House again without having informed senior Justice Department officials. This is the third time that we know of from this indictment, and accepted the defendant's offer that he become Attorney General. So the offer is actually made. Now, this is why he steps up his accusation in a letter. He's like, I am this close. The same day that I changed this letter, I'm on my way to the White House, again, against the explicit instructions of the top officials at the Justice Department. But I'm going there to collect my new credentials as the guy who now has the right to kick these two guys out. And say, no more telling me I need permission to meet with the President of the United States. I can do it anytime I want. And it's now official that the Justice Department says there's evidence of fraud. That's what he had planned for January 3rd. On the afternoon of January 3rd, though, co-conspirator 4 spoke with a deputy White House counsel. The previous month, that deputy White House counsel had informed the defendant that, quote, there is no world, there is no option in which you do not leave the White House on January 20th. I mean, that's pretty stark, right? And he still has a job at this point. Now, the same deputy White House counsel tried to dissuade co-conspirator 4 from assuming the role of Attorney General. The deputy White House counsel reiterated to co-conspirator 4 that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election, and that if the defendant remained in office, nonetheless, there would be, quote, riots in every major city in the United States. And Clark, who thinks he's about to become Attorney General, responds, well, person, whoever the deputy White House counsel is, I don't know, is that Cipollone? He's the White House counsel, right? Who's the deputy? I can't remember anymore. Well, that's why there's an Insurrection Act, which is maybe one of the most amazing paragraphs in this entire indictment. I mentioned it the day we got a hold of the thing, but all this reading has been a wind up really to this. This just has to be put in context. Clark is 100% certain that he's right. Clark is 100% certain that he's going to be able to force other people to recognize he's right. And if they don't, he is 100% certain that Trump will name him Attorney General, and he will be able to say, now I'm the guy who gets to define what's right and wrong. You're all out. Everybody who disagrees with me is fired. And yes, there may be riots in the streets in every major city in America because of what I'm about to do. But that's why there's an Insurrection Act, because then I'll not only be acting Attorney General, right? But I'll also be able to call out the armed forces of the United States, call up the militia, use the National Guard to suppress the dissent because of how official I am. I'm now the top law enforcement official in the country, minus the President of the United States, who's a lunatic. And we're a team. And anybody who's against us is a rebel, and you're going in. That's the plan. That's the point at which they say, yes, the whole thing rests on our ability to convince people that I, as, here's the button, Attorney General, and along with the President of the United States, we're in the right by virtue of our positions to call out the army, to cut you down if you think there's something wrong with our claims and Trump staying in office. Ultimately, it comes down to that. We're going to try 10 different legal tricks. And if you don't like any of them, if you don't like this one, we'll try another one. You don't like this one, we'll try another one. You don't like this one, we'll try an even more outlandish one. You don't like any of them, you're dead. How do you like them apples? That's the conspiracy. But there's more. Paragraph 82. Also that afternoon, co-conspirator 4 met with the actual Attorney General and told him, well, you don't like this plan? Okay. Told him that defendant had decided to put co-conspirator 4, me, Jeffrey Clark, in charge of the Justice Department. The Attorney General responded that he would not accept being fired by a subordinate and immediately scheduled a meeting with the defendant for that evening. Now, at this point, Jeff Clark is probably like, good, go ahead, meet with him. That's fine. He already offered me the job. He's going to tell you the same, and he's going to say, I don't care whether you accept being fired by a subordinate or not. He's not your subordinate. He's the acting Attorney General, and you're not. Go away. That's what Clark expects to happen here. He's betting the house on it, right? So, he has a meeting scheduled for later that evening. Clark says, good, go ahead, meet with him. It won't work. On the evening of January 3rd, the defendant met for a briefing on overseas national securities issues with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, remember him, and other senior national security advisors. The chairman briefed the defendant on the issue, which had previously arisen in December, as well as possible ways the defendant could handle it, whatever the issue was. Not that, Trump really understood what he was listening to. When the chairman and another advisor recommended that the defendant take no action on this specific national security issue because Inauguration Day was only 17 days away and any course of action would trigger something unhelpful, the defendant calmly agreed, stating, yeah, you're right. It's too late for us. We're going to give that to the next guy. So when General Milley and the other brass are in there, essentially this is being offered to show Trump saying, yeah, I'm not going to be the president in 17 days. With everyone else he's meeting with and people he's going to meet with later that night and had met with earlier that day, the line was, I'm going to be president come January 20th because I won and we've got it rigged up. The Republicans in the state legislatures are going to do what we want them to do. The Justice Department is going to help them do it and we're going to stay in office, even if we need the Insurrection Act to do it. Now, at that point, the defendant moved immediately from this national security briefing in which he said, yeah, I'm not going to be president anymore. Moved immediately from this to the meeting that the Attorney General had requested earlier that day, which included co-conspirator 4, the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, the Justice Department's Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, the White House counsel, the Deputy White House counsel, the one who had earlier said there's no way you're staying in office, there's no world in which that happens, and another senior advisor. At the meeting, the defendant expressed frustration with the Attorney General for failing to do anything to overturn the election results. And the group discussed co-conspirator 4's plans to investigate purported election fraud and to send this proposed letter to state officials, a copy of which was provided to the defendant during the meeting. The defendant relented in his plan to replace the Attorney General with co-conspirator 4, only when he was told that it would result in mass resignations at the Justice Department and of his own White House counsel. I don't know why that frightened him so much, but it apparently did, and he backs down. And it's at this point, I really wish we had a camera on Jeff Clark. He's in this meeting, sure that this is his moment, like he's been waiting all his life, like some teenage John Hughes movie where everything finally goes his way and he exacts his revenge. Ha! You thought you were going to throw me out? I'm throwing you out. The president promised me this earlier today. Hours later, it all falls apart because Trump's a liar. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. This is it, last segment of the week. We'll try and get through the rest of this indictment. There's still a lot of other news that we're trying to sneak in. That might have to wait until Monday, but at least maybe we can call things out at the end and say, all right, we knew about this. We weren't ignoring it entirely, but we were ignoring it entirely. When we left off, I did say I wish we had had a camera in that room, not so much just to capture the illegality. That would have been helpful. But really, honestly, just for, I would have granted everyone immunity just to have, not really, what's his name? Jeff Clark's face. A camera on Jeff Clark's face when he finds out that the solid plan to make him Attorney General, or rather, to make him acting Attorney General, and for him to exact revenge on all the bullies who kept him down, and now he was the most important guy in America, all falls apart, despite the fact that the President of the United States, purportedly the President of the United States of America, had just told him hours before, basically, make your plans, buy a new house, buy a boat, schedule a vacation. You're going to run the country, or at least law enforcement in this country, starting tonight. And he goes into the meeting thinking it's all lined up. And then these two guys, who he thinks, these two guys are too dumb to run this thing. I'm the only one who really sees the truth. And these two dummies talk the president out of the plan right in front of him, and the whole thing falls apart. And I was saying, I just wanted to, I wish not only a camera wouldn't tell the story, but hopefully we could read it on his face. The moment not only where he sees the plan fall apart, but the moment where he realizes, oh my God, I've just trusted Donald effing Trump. Everybody knows that everything Trump touches dies. I spent the whole day dreaming of what I was going to do with my newfound power. And I forgot that the power was based on a promise from Donald Trump. And it just crumbled. Not only did it crumble and fall apart, but it crumbled and fell apart right in front of the two enemies I was planning to get rid of first act of my new powerful position. And they saw it happen. And they're still here. And they're going to be the ones that kick my stupid ass out of my office. Pack your stuff. Get a box. Give Clark a box. Security, I want this MFer out of the building by, I don't know what time it was at that point. I want him out of here in 60 minutes. Imagine going from, I'm going to be Attorney General. I'm going to be the one that turns everything around. The whole country, all of you MFers, all 80 million of you who voted for Joe Biden. You were all wrong. The news told you Joe Biden was going to be the next president. I'm so effing smart and so effing powerful and such a great effing lawyer that I'm going to reverse all of that right in your effing faces. He was ready to do that. He was convinced that's what happened. And that's what was happening. And he had been called into a meeting for the purpose of announcing to America that had just happened. And instead, what happens is, you know what? Actually, I'm a little bit scared. F you, Clark. Get the F out of here. I never want to see you again. Get out of my sight. You're an idiot. I would love to have seen that. That's a close second to seeing Trump indicted, tried and convicted for all this. Although there's a few outcomes from the conviction I guess I would list sooner, or is more interesting to me to see than having witnessed this moment. But, they can't leave Clark unindicted. I have to have this moment at some point. Well, I want to see him in court finding out that his plan was a house of cards. That must have been really something. Anyway, there's more to this indictment, as it turns out, but that's one of the most exciting parts for me. And probably not just because of the weird, hapless idiot Jeff Clark who has set himself up in all this, but remember that at the critical moment, the reason he deserves all of this is that at the critical moment he says, yeah, well, if you don't like it, I'm going to use that power to kill you all. He's like the Mad King of in Game of Thrones. Let them burn them all. Everybody dies or is arrested. I'm such a great lawyer, I'm going to convince the world that everything they saw with their own eyes is fake. How are you going to do that? Well, what I'll do is I'll murder anybody or arrest anybody who doesn't believe me. And then everybody will run around saying, for their own good, that I was right. And I mean, what could be more deserving of this kind of fall than somebody who would do something like that? Though there are probably some other punishments that should really supersede the embarrassment, that internal burning behind your face, realizing that you effed up the whole thing. It should be prison. In some countries, it would be execution. But we're a generous lot. Anyway, so there we are. Right. The defendant relented in his plan to replace the Attorney General with co-conspirator 4 only when he was told it would result in mass resignations at the Justice Department and of his own White House counsel. And I got to tell you, I don't know what magic prompts that. Remember that his whole administration is full of acting officials, not even acting officials, people he just put there with no actual authority. I don't know what scares him, particularly if he really thinks I'm only going to be president for another week anyway. Why he's frightened by mass resignations, I have no idea. But thank God the magic worked for some reason. That was like the only guardrail that held. Paragraph 85. At the meeting in the Oval Office on the night of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 suggested that the Justice Department should opine that the vice president should, and could rather, exceed his lawful authority during the certification proceeding and change the election outcome. So now one more last-ditch effort is being offered. Not just that we could send it back to the states, but that maybe we could even short-circuit that. We think the Justice Department should step up and tell Pence, you're wrong, you do have this authority. Remember, Pence is disagreeing up to this point and continues to. But he wants the Justice Department to weigh in. Now, when the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel began to explain why the Justice Department should not do so, the defendant, Trump, said, no one here should be talking to the vice president. I'm talking to the vice president, and ended the discussion. That's pretty interesting. So, why does that get in there? Why does that wind things up? Not only is it a call to end the discussion, but it's the end of this section, and it's the end cap, or the capstone, I guess I should say, the other cap word, the capstone on this section of that puts the point on of why Trump is the central figure in all this. And this is the capper of the defendant's attempt to leverage the Justice Department to use deceit to get state officials to replace legitimate electors and electoral votes with the defendants. Remember, that's the section we're in. And it ends with Trump saying, nobody should be talking to the vice president. I will personally handle how we will leverage the vice president to convince everybody of my deceitful plan to replace the electors, the legitimate electors, with the fake ones. I'll take care of the vice president. And remember that he eventually takes care of them by telling people, yeah, you should basically hang him. Next section, the defendant's attempts to enlist the vice president, again, to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceeding. So we've already heard the background of a lot of this in the news, but it recounts all of it here, beginning with paragraph 86. As the January 6th congressional certification proceeding approached, and other efforts to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function of certifying Biden failed, the defendant sought to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification to fraudulently alter the election results. Clark, of course, had just said, we think the Justice Department should tell the vice president that he does have this power. But then he never gets the chance to do that because he never becomes attorney general. So the president says, I'll just carry that message forward. The defendant did this first by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to convince the vice president to accept the defendant's fraudulent electors and then reject the legitimate ones, or send the electoral votes back to the state legislatures, at least, for review rather than count them. But when all of that failed, the defendant attempted, this is important, listen, Mike, you can just overrule them and say, I like this set of electors, not that set of electors. The Justice Department says you can do it. All right, well, the Justice Department didn't say you could do it, but I say you can do it. I'm the president. You can do it. No, I can't do that. It's just a ceremonial role. Well, I'll tell you what. You can do this ceremony. You're going to get two sets of electors. Just say, I don't know what to do. You don't want to if you don't have the courage to just say, I'm going to choose these, then you say, somebody else will choose. Send them back to the state legislatures. Let them choose. And I'll talk to them about which one they should choose. Just say you don't know. And he said no to that too. When that failed, the defendant attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C., violence, the threat of violence, to pressure the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results. Wow. Well, just like Jeff Clark, he's crazy too. None of my legalistic reasoning worked. None of my attempts to get you to say, well, at least you could kick the can to somebody else, right? No, you still won't even do that? Fine. We'll threaten your job or murder you. How about that? Do you like that? Would that make it convince you to do this after all? Paragraph 87. On December 19th, 2020, after cultivating widespread anger and resentment for weeks with his knowingly false claims of election fraud, the defendant urged his supporters to travel to Washington, where they would be able to grab hold of Mike Pence physically. Like if they stay in their states and they stay angry, I don't know that Mike Pence is all that worried. But if they're outside and surrounding the building that he's in, does that increase the pressure? Yes, it does. Right? So he stokes this anger so that when he calls them to Washington, they will respond. Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. We'll be wild. Throughout late December, he repeatedly urged his supporters to come to Washington for January 6th. On December 23rd, the defendant retweeted a memo titled Operation Pence Card. I guess it was supposed to be Trump card, a play on that, but it wasn't Trump that was supposed to do the thing. It was Pence, which, what did this memo do? It falsely asserted that the vice president could, among other things, unilaterally disqualify legitimate electors from 6 targeted states. On the same day, December 23rd, co-conspirator 2, that's Eastman, circulated a 2-page memo outlining a plan for the vice president to unlawfully declare the defendant, Trump, the certified winner of the presidential election. In the memo, Eastman claimed that 7 states had transmitted 2 slates of electors and proposed that the vice president announce that, quote, because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, there are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states. This is like backstop number 3, right? We want you to say, I hereby declare the Trump electors to be the real ones. No, I definitely don't have that power. All right, well then how about if you just say, I can't tell you. I hereby declare that I don't have the power. You're right, you don't have the power. Let's say you don't have the power. I hereby declare that we will send these back to the states, which do have the power. They don't have the power to decide as between these two. Well, I'm not going to do that either. All I'm supposed to do is count the real certificates, and we know which ones the real certificates are. All right. How about this one? What about I can't decide which one is right, and I don't think the states can decide which one is right either. But what am I going to do? I have 2, one that says Trump, one that says Biden. All right, then the fair thing to do. Mike, you're so fair. You're so honest. Here's what you should do. You just say, well, because we have 2 and we can't tell which one's which, and I won't decide for you, let's just say there's no electors from those states, and just say, sorry, it's a tie, and everybody else who has only 1 slate, we'll just count that slate, and just as we were supposed to, we're going to abide by the law, and then we'll count up how many electoral votes everybody has, and then, well, the problem is that if you do that with the 7 states, you'll end up with Biden not having the 270 electoral votes that he's entitled to and would need to become president under the Constitution. And then you say, all right, well, the Constitution tells us what to do in that situation. The House of Representatives votes to elect the president, but they vote as states, not individual members. And we've already done the calculations, and Republicans hold the right number of strategically placed seats in this country, that there would be a majority of votes by state for Trump to become president, but that would be totally legal. That's exactly what the Constitution says you're supposed to do if nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes. Of course, we can only get to that point by throwing out the critical number of electoral votes. Will you do that, Mike? That's the new ask. See what happens with that one. I mean, you know what the outcome is, right? In the memorandum, Eastman puts forth this plan. And then next, co-conspirator 2 proposed steps that he acknowledged violated the Electoral Count Act, advocating that, in the end, Pence gavels President Trump as elected. Just 2 months earlier, on October 11th, Eastman himself had taken the opposite position, writing that neither the Constitution nor the Electoral Count Act provided the vice president any discretion in counting of electoral votes or permitted him to make the determination on his own. Again, this is a great illustration of Eastman's own progression, right? He's got this fantastical plan that he puts together, but then realizes, neither the Constitution nor the Electoral Count Act actually give him this power. Well, if we don't give him the power to do it, then what are we going to do? We're screwed. And then he began to consider, he might not actually technically have the power, but suppose he claimed it anyway. Who could stop him? That's the real question, right? If he just says, in my opinion, this is authorized by the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, somebody could object in Congress, but if you split up the houses and send them back to their respective houses and ask them to vote, presumably the Democratic Senate comes back and says, no, that's not going to work. And the Republican House, though, comes back and says, no, we will accept that. And then I guess you have a split between the two parties to the joint session. I don't know what happens. I think what normally happens is they say, unless there's agreement between the houses, the status quo prevails. And no, you don't have the power to do this. But they might argue, disagree, and I think we do have the power to do this. And I don't know whether they thought they were going to change votes in the Senate or whether it was just going to be the vice president saying this is not open to discussion or debate and there's not going to be any vote, which seems like something that the members of Congress probably wouldn't stand for. But I don't know. That's the plan. But I think it was so confounding that, and it looked like the end of the line, that Eastman, who was enjoying being counsel to the president on this, said, well, maybe he can just declare it, because what do you do? Appeal it to the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court's going to dismiss it as a political question. So it's going to be up to a vote that's held in Congress, and we think we can win that vote, or just we don't really know how that vote would be engineered, because you can't vote in joint sessions. There are no votes allowed in the joint sessions. If there's any question that has to be settled, the two houses divide, they go back to their respective houses, and you still have the problem of one of the bodies is not going to vote. If people vote by party affiliation anyway, they're not going to agree to go along with this thing. So I don't know how you engineer it. You don't get there with a vote. So that's when Eastman says, well, either I surrender all the power of possibly being the key advisor to the guy who takes over as president for life and ends the republic, which would be a pretty sweet position to be in. If the republic's going to end, that's where you want to be. Or I either abandon those hopes or I come up with something else. And so he decided to go with, maybe there doesn't have to be a vote. I reject my previous position. That's pretty amazing. And of course shows, goes to state of mind for an unindicted co-conspirator anyway, when he gets indicted. And he really has to be indicted because he too threatens violence underlying the whole thing, because eventually, well, I can't get to a vote. All right. Well, then maybe there doesn't need to be a vote. Oh, maybe we won't even get to the declaration though by Pence. He might not assume that power. Well, then we'll just kill everybody. There'll be riots in the streets and violence will settle the whole thing. And sometimes that's justified, like when no one will listen to you. That's when it's justified. Looks like I accidentally might have deleted my acting thing. What am I going to do now? I need that back. Shoot. I hate this soundboard. It's too easy to do that too. I thought this thing was locked, and it is locked. Why was I able to delete things? Anyway, back to the actual story here. So he reverses his position in order to keep things going. Now, paragraph 90, on several private phone calls in late December and in early January, the defendant repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud and directly pressured the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding on January 6th to fraudulently overturn the results of the election. And the vice president resisted, including on December 25th, Christmas, when the vice president called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas. Trump says, yeah, Merry Christmas, but listen to this. The defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6th and his request that the vice president reject electoral votes that day. The vice president pushed back, telling the defendant, as the vice president already had in previous conversations, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome. On December 29th, as reflected in the vice president's contemporaneous notes, which means, of course, that's a good explanation for Pence's finding a backbone these days. Now everybody knows that he turned his contemporaneous notes over to the special counsel. So according to those notes, the defendant falsely told the vice president on December 29th that the Justice Department was finding major infractions. They weren't. On January 1st, the defendant called the vice president and berated him because he had learned that the vice president had opposed a lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that at the certification, the vice president had the authority to reject or return votes to the states under the Constitution. The vice president responded that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authority. And in fact, as we discussed the day earlier, there was no constitutional basis for asking for this sort of prospective advisory opinion from the courts either. The vice president says, I don't think that's possible. It's improper. In response, the defendant told the vice president, you're too honest. What a thing to be labeled. You're too honest. Within hours of the conversation, the defendant reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification proceeding, tweeting, the big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal. Why was he doing this? This happens immediately after the Pence says no for the millionth time. He says, I'll tell you what, my next most important priority is gathering a mob within physical striking distance of Mike Pence. And that's what I'm going to do. On January 3rd, the defendant again told the vice president that at the certification proceeding, the vice president had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. The vice president responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected the lawsuit making the claim the previous day. Not only rejecting the theory, but if they were smart, they probably also said, by the way, we're not even allowed to handle this case. It's an advisory opinion. We don't do those. Paragraph 91. On January 3rd, co-conspirator 2, Eastman, circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, contrary to the Electoral Count Act, ECA, the vice president would send the elector slates to the state legislatures to determine which slate to count. On January 4th, the defendant held a meeting with co-conspirator 2, the vice president's chief of staff, and the vice president's counsel for the purpose of convincing the vice president, based on the defendant's knowingly false claims of election fraud, that the vice president should reject or send to the states Biden's legitimate electoral votes rather than count them. The defendant deliberately excluded his White House counsel from the meeting because the White House counsel previously had pushed back on the defendant's false claims of election fraud. So he rigs the meeting. He's rigging it. It's all rigged. Every Republican accusation is a confession. I rig my own meetings. During that meeting, as reflected in the vice president's contemporaneous notes, the defendant made knowingly false claims of election fraud, including, bottom line, I won every state. This is I can't decide whether this is the most egregious false statement, the most incredible thing in the whole indictment, or Clark's, that's why there's an Insurrection Act is the most incredible. This is the claim. Imagine sitting there listening to the guy who purported to be president of the United States, who had a nuclear arsenal at his disposal, still at that point, say, this is what it all comes down to. Bottom line, I won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes. We won every state. He thought he had a 50-state landslide by margins of 100,000 or more in every single state. And he's serious. The guy should be in mental care somewhere. And the fact that he's not, I have maintained a long time, is actually elder abuse by his kids. That's a separate issue. But this guy should not be free on his own recognizance. He's not responsible enough to do anything. He won every state. Are you kidding? So there you go. All of this, he claims, regarding his claim that his senior Justice Department officials previously told him was false, including as recently as the night before. What about 205,000 votes more in Pennsylvania than voters? The defendant and co-conspirator 2 then asked Vice President to either unilaterally reject the legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states or send the question of which slate was legitimate to the targeted states' legislatures. When the vice president challenged co-conspirator 2 on whether the proposal to return the question to the states was defensible, co-conspirator 2 responded, well, nobody's tested it before. The vice president then told the president, did you hear that? Even your own counsel is not saying that I have that authority. All they'll say is, well, nobody's ever tested it before, at best. The defendant responded, that's okay. I prefer the other suggestion of the vice president rejecting the electors unilaterally, right? Did you hear that? He just said, I don't have authority to send it back to the states. That's okay. I don't want you to send it back to the states. I think you just throw them out. Paragraph 94, also on January 4th, when co-conspirator 2 acknowledged to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told co-conspirator 2, you're going to cause riots in the street. Co-conspirator 2, Eastman now, responded that there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. After that conversation, the senior advisor notified the defendant that Eastman, co-conspirator 2, had conceded that his plan was, quote, not going to work. But it was okay. He was going to continue with it anyway, because sometimes violence is necessary to defend the republic. I'm not sure when exactly. He didn't give me examples. But what happens here, what the basic takeaway from this that I want you to take away is this is the second co-conspirator to say, yes, violence underlies the whole thing. Yes, it looks like we're going to have to resort to that. The president's response to that is, I will arrange for the violence. I will tell them where to go. I will tell them where to meet. I will instruct the Secret Service not to disarm them with magnetometers at the entrance to the rally that I'm planning as a staging area. And then I will literally set them on foot. Remember that? Toward the Capitol and tell them they are the last line of defense. They need to do what needs to be done. Fight like hell or you're not going to have a country anymore, he tells them, and then sets them on their way. You say I need violence, and you say I need violence, I am going to procure that violence. And that's why I've spent 3 days reading this indictment to you. On the morning of January 5th, at the defendant's direction, the vice president's chief of staff and the vice president's counsel met again with co-conspirator 2. Co-conspirator 2 now advocated that the vice president do what the defendant had said he preferred the day before, unilaterally reject the electors from the targeted states. That's Eastman changing his mind on the fundamental legalities of the whole thing a third time. During this meeting, co-conspirator 2 privately acknowledged to the vice president's counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of his proposal because he understood it would be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. The vice president's counsel expressed to co-conspirator 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. That same day, the defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington on January 6th, coincidentally, and he set the false expectation that the vice president had the authority to and might use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding to reverse the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing a bunch of tweets, now infamous. I can't read them all to you. We are, in fact, out of time. I used up the whole show once again on the indictment, and I'm proud to have done it. Quite honestly.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, listen, there's news, there's other stuff. It's stuff that's important. It's stuff you need to know for the weekend. I didn't get to do it for you. I don't know what to tell you. I can tell you this, though. Justice Putnam has a whole show planned, the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, where he will be addressing other issues. I recommend highly that you tune in and listen to it. And we're going to torture you with this more next week, I bet. See you then.